moderator wrote one of the articles in it. Meredith Salisbury, who's been writing for Techonomy almost since the beginning and is a real expert in health science, and particularly with genomics, which is a big part of what's happening with cancer, which is what the topic of our next panel is, which is the topic of our next panel. So welcome, Meredith, and make sure you read her article, and she will introduce her panel.
Thank you, and I'm glad to have my panel with me. As David said, my name is Meredith Salisbury. I write for Techonomy. I also work with a PR firm called BioScribe. And I have to say, I'm kind of having a moment here because I'm a fan of all of the people on my panel. So what we wanted to do with this panel is really look at the very cool things happening on the tech side, on the science side. And the way we chose to look at that was through the lens of cancer, right? Because we could sit here for days and talk about genomics and CRISPR and all sorts of things. But we're going to try to use cancer as the lens through which to view all of this and tease out some of the opportunities and obstacles that we're seeing. So with me, I have Jill from Color Genomics. I've got Andrew from Memorial Sloan Kettering, Eric from Mount Sinai. And I want to start with, just very briefly, some success stories. I like to do the good news first. So I want to look at some of the opportunity we have in cancer, in related fields, through some of the most exciting things we're seeing. Jill, you want to start?
Sure. So my background, I'm a board-certified pathologist with subspecialty boards in molecular genetic pathology, and I also did a fellowship in informatics. So essentially, I've been doing precision medicine since before precision medicine had a name.
Is that why I'm a fan?
And you know, there's been this promise, really, you know, since early in my career, that we were going to get to a point where we could actually start doing real preventative genetics and preventative medicine, or more genomics-driven preventative medicine, and we're really at that point in time right now. And so it's really, it's an exciting time in genomics when we can actually start to see the price, you know, reach a price point where we can get it outside of our broken healthcare system, which doesn't pay for preventative health, right? It's not incentivized to do that. And now it's cheap enough we can get it outside the system, and consumers can pay for it themselves, or self-insured employers can provide it as a health benefit for their employees. And so inherited disease testing, I think, is kind of one of the lowest hanging fruits in genomics. And we're, you know, companies like Color, for $249, you can look at 30 genes associated with hereditary cancer and have all complementary genetic counseling that you need. Everything's online, spit-based, on your mobile phone, connected with your doctor. Your physician is ordering the test. And so we've really kind of removed all the barriers to getting preventative information about yourself so that you don't have to actually develop the cancer. You can hopefully, if you're at high risk, determine that ahead of time and prevent yourself from getting cancer in the first place.
And Jill, just tell people, so $249 sounds great, but tell us what that was in comparison to. I mean,
oh, yeah, so, you know, a few years ago, Myriad was kind of the only show in town, and they gave you two genes. They gave you BRCA1, BRCA2, and it was about $4,000. So we've really come a long way in just a few years. And that's really due to the maturation, I think, of next-gen sequencing.
So Andrew, you've just been doing amazing things with actually treating patients who have very advanced stages of cancer with personalized approaches. Tell us about that.
So I think the conversations taking place here today are so timely for cancer medicine because for the first time, sort of in my career at least, I can actually say I'm an oncologist and it's an exciting time to be an oncologist. And why is that? Because we're actually living through a convergence of new technologies, new therapies that we're finally starting to see the fruits of 30, 40 years of research actually impacting the patient in the clinic. So the sort of personal story I would put to sort of contextualize this is that when I started as a medical student 30 years ago, 1987, when we went around and actually did rounds on patients, checked in on patients, I would carry with me an index card. And each patient had an index card, and the information that I needed to know to take care of that one patient was contained on that one index card. Now fast forward 30 years to where we are now. And in order for me to take care of my patients, I have to now be able to sift through gigabytes of data and find that needle in a haystack. But the transformative power of being able to do this is really quite real. So I'll give you one example of a patient treated at our center. This is a young 7-year-old girl who, at the age of 5, had been diagnosed with a very unusual tumor. When you look under the microscope, it was very hard to tell what it was. And because of that, our therapies are generally guided by what the diagnosis is. This child was treated with a variety of different toxic therapies. And she went through, I think, some 20 cycles of chemotherapy, endured 4 or 5 different surgeries. And then at the end of this course, was told after 3 years of therapy, there's nothing more we can do. The tumor has grown back, and we have no other options. And so she was actually transitioned over to palliative care, end-of-life care. She ended up coming to our center, where we took all the approaches that we could in terms of characterizing her tumor from a genetic point of view, from looking at her DNA, looking at the RNA in her tumor cells. And what we found was that her tumor actually contained a breakage between 2 of the chromosomes and a rejoining of those 2 chromosomes in a way that had never been described before. It resulted in a protein that no one within the biomedical community had ever seen. But it turns out that one of the partners that the breakage was centered around was a protein called AKT, which we do have drugs for. Now, the traditional way of sort of approaching this patient would have been to say, well, that's great, we will go into the lab and actually study this protein, and maybe 10 years from now figure out how it works and whether we can treat this particular tumor using this drug. But 10 years from now, that patient would not be with us. And so instead what we did was we went to our adult colleagues who actually were testing in a phase 1 trial a inhibitor of AKT, and we convinced the company to actually let us try it in this child. This drug had never been in a child before, but we obtained the drug on a compassionate use basis, gave it to the child, and within 30 days, the tumor had completely disappeared. She had achieved a complete remission. This is a child whose cancer was driven by an alteration no one had ever seen. She was given a drug that no child had ever received, but our ability to actually match specific deficiencies that result in cancer with potential therapies is really underscored by this example. And so we have actually reached a point where we can actually use the kind of technologies we're talking about today to actually impact a patient in the clinic, and that's why I actually say I'm excited to be an oncologist.
Great. Yeah, indeed. Eric, how about you? Cancer is just one of the, sorry, I'm echoing. Cancer is just one of the areas you guys work on at Mount Sinai, but this has been so successful there, you're about to have a major change within Mount Sinai. So tell us about that and your success stories.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say I'm a mathematician, not an oncologist or a pathologist. But I've spent the last 5 years sort of echoing what you just heard, and that we are now testing that the genome's relevant for everybody today. And we are now have a throughput of about 100 to 150,000 samples a year that we're testing, and that covers largely reproductive health, so think carrier screening, non-invasive prenatal testing, newborn screening, heritable cancer screening, and then on into the oncology space where we're looking at the somatic genome, both DNA and RNA, very similar to what Josh just indicated. And the studies we've carried out have shown that in the case of cancer patients, what we can uncover by sequencing your tumor, much as was just conveyed on the 7-year-old girl, 90% of those cases we can come up with medically actionable guidance to inform the course of care. And us, like Sloan and many others, are carrying out the larger studies to demonstrate that that actually helps outcomes. There are definitely cases where you can get people into complete remission, but we're sort of not at that stage for everybody today. So we're all still learning, what are the right scales of data we need to generate to do that. So we're pretty proud of that fact. We're one of the largest testing providers in the greater New York City area for informing on genetic conditions. 1/3 of the undiagnosed conditions we have coming through our rare disorder clinic that are unresolved through standard of care pursuits are resolved through genomic sequencing, where you can give a definitive diagnosis and in some cases directly indicates a treatment that the individual can receive. But the thing I'm most excited about is, how do we sort of take that all to the next level and engage broader communities with it? And it's kind of the work we've done to engage patients in their kind of health course journey to aggregate more information around them. What exists on you today in your medical record is pretty sparse. The 5 minutes you might spend with a doctor per year doesn't really give a very accurate view of what's actually going on inside of you unless you have something sort of in the tails of the distribution from one of the tests that are administered. And what we had shown with Apple was our ability to basically engage patients electronically. In the case of asthma and COPD, where we had 10,000 people enroll in an IRB-approved, first ever IRB-approved research study where you're electronically consented. We enrolled 10,000 people in a couple of weeks for the cost of developing that app, about $100,000, and generating one of the largest asthma cohorts in the country, right, in a matter of weeks. And if you think about what that would have taken through traditional R01-driven, National Institutes of Health-funded research, that would have been 5+ years, millions of dollars, multiple investigators, and you still would have been sort of having a very isolated geographic region covered, with that cohort. So super excited about the ability to engage patients more directly, electronically, to complement the information that's being acquired in the medical system. And we believe, that as these sensors get better and better and more numerous, that we're going to be able to generate better health profiles on you outside the medical system than inside.
Great. So one of the things I want to get to, so Andrew, I think you kind of led us to this point. This was an amazing story you shared. But the other side of it that we're not talking about is that it's not really scalable, right? I mean, having to go personally to a drug company and convince them and get the compassionate use from FDA, we can't do that for every single patient. And someone at an amazing place like Sloan has a much better chance of that than someone in rural Ohio, right? So how do we take advantage of this and really scale it up? And is that possible?
So I think that there are aspects of the genomic analysis that I do think is scalable. So at Memorial Sloan Kettering, for example, we have now done genomic characterization, if you will, of 17,000 patients. And so in that particular case, we're focusing on the approximately 500 genes that are associated with cancer. That now is a approved test that has a turnaround time that is clinically tractable. And so the idea of using maybe not whole genome characterization, but broader gene characterization to actually guide patients to the right treatments, I think is a real and is a reality now. The ability to bring those costs down, the value proposition in making sure that we get the data out in terms of how these types of technology impact outcome so that ultimately they are reimbursed, not only by commercial insurers, but also government plans. I think those are the ways that we actually propagate the type of technologies that exist right now, maybe more so in the ivory tower than in rural areas. That's how we get it to be more democratic and widely dispersed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of accessibility now that the price has come down, and that's not as much of a barrier as it used to be. Now it's just a matter of making it more accessible to more people at the time that they need it. And that's one of the, I mean, this conference is great, right? It's this combination, we're talking about healthcare and tech, and out in Silicon Valley, that, you know, a doctor like myself can, after spending decades training and working in the incumbent health system, you know, move out to Silicon Valley and partner up with, you know, some senior executives from Google and Twitter, and start to just like take a problem and just break it down, and use design theory to make healthcare, you know, easier and more streamlined, and remove the barriers. And I think we really are, you know, at a point where there's companies like Color that, you know, everything's accessible from your mobile phone. And if you're in rural Ohio, you know, as long as you've got a mobile phone, you can start to access you know, information about yourself. Getting your tumor in the spit kit in the mail is a little harder, but, you know, we got to start where we can start.
Right. So accessibility and consumer empowerment have been themes so far, but we have this rising tension where we're giving consumers more and more hope, you know, that they can afford the test, that they can get access to things. But we still have this medical system that says the consumer has to be kept at a remove, right? There's got to be a physician gatekeeper in there. The consumers, they're you know, very uncomfortable with the consumers having direct access to anything. How do we just deal with that as it is? Do we get past it somehow? Eric, you wanna?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and what we can't do is sort of throw all caution to the wind and directly engage consumers around this kind of information that can have very significant consequences on their health. And, you know, something even as simple as drug safety, PGX, you know, big pushback from the FDA on just going direct to consumer with that information. Because why? Because a consumer may stop taking a medication based on that information without the proper consultation, and that could affect ultimately affect their outcomes. So I think it is about how to engage technology in a way that facilitates more seamless connection to physician counseling, genetic counseling, and so on. You know, one of the products we've built is an electronic genetic counseling platform. And why do we do that? Well, it's to modernize the you know, the IT side of the genetic counseling, right? As the tests grow, right? So sequencing on a super Moore's law curve, right? And not been a technology in humankind where that's been true before. And so the complexity of the tests are growing exponentially. So the demand for counseling, so right in our carrier screening, 70% of the women tested test positive for something. So that demands some kind of counseling. So as those tests grow exponentially, the genetic counselors are growing sublinearly, right? So it's not a scalable solution, not sustainable. The only way you're going to solve that problem is through software. And so by you know, leveraging software to help facilitate more seamless engagement of patient with the medical information, I think is going to be one of the ways that gets solved, sort of the telemedicine approach you're seeing in rather widespread use today.
And Jill, what about you for Color? It is this difficulty where, you know, if I wanted to, and this is actually not hypothetical, I have done this, I wanted to get myself a breast cancer risk test. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't entirely sure the insurance company would pay for it because there wasn't a clear sign that it was relevant. I actually called some companies and they said, no, you know, even if you're willing to fork over the money yourself, you can't have this test without a physician sign off on it. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so the founders of Color all were touched by cancer in their background. And one of our founders is a BRCA2 carrier. His mother is a BRCA2 carrier. She's had cancer twice. His grandmother died of cancer. And even this, you know, affluent family had trouble getting themselves tested and all their at-risk family members tested. And that was really kind of the nidus of what started Color and why our flagship product is around hereditary cancer. There was just so many ridiculous barriers in our incumbent healthcare system. And so it's a matter, like I said, of like just kind of deconstructing it and watching the workflows, and whenever we can, you know, engineering each part of that workflow where you're keeping the responsibility, right? You don't want to give people this important health information and not give them the proper support to understand it, right? So the scaling of genetic counseling is part of what we do. You know, the engineers just sat and watched the genetic counselors go through their day and everything that they had to do, and then, you know, went back into the whiteboard and kind of like, where can we cut the fat out of this? And so the accessibility is a really important part of the philosophy at Color. And so then, you know, the regulatory aspects around where is that line between direct to consumer. We don't actually have a definition of it, and so you're never really quite sure. But we've tried to work with the regulatory bodies to make sure we're CLIA compliant, CAP compliant, CE marked. We're physician ordered test. It's always ordered by a physician. If you've got your physician, great, your physician can order it. If not, we work with multiple external physicians, third-party network of physicians, and so if you're curious and you want to know if you've got a risk for hereditary cancer syndrome, you can just go to the website and sign up. If you don't have a physician, we'll connect you with one, and that third-party physician reviews your health intake survey and determines whether or not this is the right test for you, and then they'll order it, and everything else comes online at an 8th grade level. We try to, I think, that our incumbent healthcare system is so frustrating and inefficient and dissatisfying to everybody, both the doctors and the patients and everybody involved in it. Why can a shoe shopper, go to Zappos and have such a lovely experience shopping for shoes? Why can't our healthcare be more like Zappos?
Yeah. So Andrew, kind of sticking with this regulatory tension concept, you and I had talked earlier about this idea that you're doing this amazing personalized work, but then you've got two troubles. You've got the FDA still requiring randomized clinical trials, which really does not work at all with this personalized concept. And you've got the potential to find drugs that would be effective that have nothing to do with the actual thing you're looking at. So maybe a diabetes drug is magically going to cure this tumor. But it's very hard to get the off-label prescription approval for that. How do you deal with this?
So I think part of the problem as a pediatric oncologist is that there are very few drugs that actually have a pediatric indication. And so even if we find a mutation that is well validated in an adult disease, we can't just prescribe that drug because most of the times the payers, insurance companies, will say, well, there's not a approved indication. And so that's why I think, as we've talked about, I can analyze the entire genome of a patient's cancer in 2 to 3 weeks, but it often takes me 6 to 8 weeks to get approval to give a drug that's associated with the change that I see. And so I think that's something that we and many others in the community are working on in terms of how do we deal with some of those regulatory burdens. The question of how do we ever going forward prove that a drug works or doesn't work, which is fundamentally what randomized trials were used to answer in the past. I think that's also changing because if through the genomic characterization and the precepts of precision medicine, if we can actually identify a highly enriched responder population, there are already examples of drugs that are moving towards approval on the basis of trials that involve 20, 30, 40 patients. And so I think that part of what we need to try to do with this precision medicine sort of paradigm is also change the regulatory approaches in terms of proving and disproving whether drugs work or not. And we have to move away from this concept that everything has to be proven through a placebo, double-blind, randomized phase 3 trial. So there needs to be innovations in clinical trials that is matched to the innovations in diagnostics and therapies that we're bringing forward.
Great. And so, Eric, your team has done a lot of work with personalized cancer therapy. Are we finally at the point where we can say that the concept that lung cancer is lung cancer is lung cancer, is that just dead now? Is everyone's cancer completely individual and personalized?
In terms of care, or in terms of?
In terms, if we could just blow up the system and start over.
So I think we all agree that the molecular characterization of the tumors gets to a far deeper level of what's going on and could guide treatment. But the bottom line is we haven't run the big studies that show, without a doubt, that that the outcomes of those individuals who are so informed are dramatically improved to the point where you want to shift that to standard of care. So I think that evidence still has to be built, and I think it gets to one of the important points we haven't really touched on here, and it's how it's access to the data. It's how do we free the data? What I've learned, not being a cancer guy, but now interacting with lots of cancer guys, is it's an intensely competitive arena, especially in New York City. There's not huge collaborative want amongst the institutions to share the data, to open that data, to empower patients to actually take their own data and share it with whomever they want. And the fact of the matter is, to get to the level of evidence we need to make this super routine, it's not going to be 5,000 or 10,000. It's going to be 1 million. The numbers have to be really big. And if you look at all the different subtypes of cancer that exist and the molecular features that can inform, think of what we need for deep learning. What have the other big information companies shown us to appropriately pull out the features that are most predictive out of hundreds of thousands of features to predict something accurately within a given subtype? You need 10 to 20,000 at least to start having those deep learning procedures take hold and deliver value. Well, to subsample 10 to 20,000 of a given type, you need millions of people to sample from to get enough numbers in that given type for that to take hold. And obviously, no single institution are gonna have those numbers. Like, the only way you're gonna win this game is by opening that data, being able to aggregate it across all institutions, and putting the patient really first in that journey, so that they can benefit the most from that data. So I think the openness, the sharing of that data, how privacy is protected when you're doing that, what role patient should have in the data that's generated on them. My position is that patient owns that data, right? It's not the medical system that owns that data. That patient should be empowered to take their own data and share it with whomever they want during the course of their care. Like in the oncology, they're fighting for their lives. And who are you? Who is the medical system to stand in your way to port that data to somebody else who may be able to advance your care? I think Andrew, the case of the 7-year-old is a good example of one who can benefit by going, to different, different groups to try to resolve their disease.
It seems like such a common sense approach, but unfortunately it flies in the face of what we actually deal with in medicine. So Eric, you've been a proponent of data sharing for a long time. Is it possible, though, given that it is seen as a competitive advantage, whether it's a company, whether it's a hospital, there are reasons that this data is siloed, and we don't like it, but is it possible for a company or a hospital to share data and still succeed?
Yeah, I think it has to be. I think the model, this company I'm transitioning out of Mount Sinai, Semaphore, that's one of its main charters to, engaging patients along their health journey and putting the data in the hands of the patient. So I think, again, if we can empower patients to, obviously the gigabytes of data Andrew says he has to deal with, you're not going to want a layperson who's having that information. They can't directly manage that information, but if we can host that information for them in the cloud, allow them through apps to decide who they want to share that information with, where they want it to go, what research studies they want it to participate in. Like, if we can do that on a global enough scale, then yeah, I believe we can sort of free that data. And once you have big enough numbers, the idea would be once you have big enough numbers, so say our testing volume, 150,000 patients a year today, we're expanding nationally. We hope to have that to 500,000 to 1 million in the next year or two. And if we're engaging all of those individuals electronically, so they're consenting for us to aggregate their information, to put that data in their hands, and then they can decide what to do with it. If we get to 1 million, where we have high dimensional data built up around people, and it's open and accessible, and in order for you to benefit from that, you're going to have to contribute your data. If you want to reflect your data off that system to get a better clinical interpretation, then your data becomes part of that system. Like, if we can get to that kind of first mover advantage where you get this network effect where the outcomes you're able to produce based on the more informed look, then I think we have a shot at everybody now having an incentive to see the data aggregated in a big open space.
So can I comment on that? I don't think that the existing barriers to sharing are actually simply because of competition. And I think the genomic data, there's already large movements afoot in terms of how to aggregate that data. But it's really the electronic medical record, the hospital records that is a problem. And that's where, on an institutional level, there are real concerns about privacy that we have to come to grips with. As a hospital, as a medical organization, we are actually subject to a fine of up to $1 million per patient record that we disclose inappropriately. And so we have to make sure that that data can be aggregated in a way that all the privacy concerns are ameliorated. The other thing that is the major sort of barrier is it would be great if all of that data were in some sort of structured and standardized format. But to hand a patient, let's say, a EMR that's a big PDF document, I don't know how useful that is in terms of the patient then taking that to aggregate with other data that might come in different formats. And so how to pull together the electronic medical records in a way that is respectful of the privacy concerns, but also in a way, in a standardized format or in a format that is useful, is something that I think we as a community have to surmount.
Well, I would say two things. First of all, if the data is so publicly accessible, I would love to get the 17,000 FASTQ files you have from the impact panel today. Can I get that? You going to send it to me so I can do better research and help the patients at Mount Sinai? I know you don't, because I've tried to get the data and don't share it. So I think there are barriers to sharing the data. What I would say on electronic medical record information, yeah, privacy is a big deal, but there are meaningful use laws in effect today that give you the right to your medical information. And you can go into your electronic medical record and pull that information down today. So I think it's like that is being addressed. I think it's all about, if you want to protect privacy, it's about just appropriate informing, right? Just inform the individual of what the risks are, what the benefits are, and let them make the decision. Don't stand in the way and pretend that there's some issue that the individual can't figure out for themselves. Yeah, how many people here today use Gmail? Like you did a digital click-through consenting on Gmail that gives Google ownership of all of your content. They can read your emails, they can use that for whatever reason they want, and yet you gladly consented. And I don't care if you have Yahoo or Hotmail, it's all the same. You do not own the content in your emails. It's owned by the company that's hosting that. Yet you agreed to that because you get a benefit back, right? With Gmail, I use Gmail even though I know I have more personal stuff in my email, I can guarantee you, than I have in my medical record. I would far rather people access my medical record information than my Gmail. Yet I agreed to that because why? Because I get free emails, I can send large attachments, it's super reliable, I can archive stuff forever, like it's a benefit. So I think it's all about helping educate patients on what's the right level of benefit that you get from doing this, right? So we don't want the digital click-through consenting of Gmail where you don't really understand what you're consenting to, but I think in the medical space we can give a more informed consent, just appropriately educate individuals and empower them, again, to leverage the meaningful use laws to take control of their information. And I agree, you don't want it in a PDF. I 100% agree that that's not useful, but if you can digitize that information and store it for them, and then let developers and app developers or other physician groups figure out ways to access that information and provide meaningful content back to the individual. The individual doesn't have to be sifting through it themselves, right? You can help them manage it in the iCloud, and you can then provide apps that engage that information in ways that benefit the consumer. And I think that's the revolution that needs to take hold.
All right, so I'd like to go through some comments. Yes, we have some. Do we have microphones? Microphones right here. Yep, coming, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, Jim Moore, and I'm interested in this competitive advantage question, and I was interested in the blushing back and forth there and that interaction, and I really would like to know what was going on there? What's the issue here? What's the 17,000 or whatever data sets you've got? What is your notion of competitive advantage that gives you? And are there alternative ways to think about that where you would make that more publicly available in a wider pool and still be advantaged as an institution? So I'd love to go at that.
Well, I think that there is we've gone through a period of time where the early adopters and the pioneers in terms of this sort of characterization were doing so on the basis of the institutions actually bearing the cost for doing the analysis, because payers still don't pay for these things. And so the initial acquisition of those data was very much sort of funded by the institutions for the patients that they were treating. Now, that said, the analysis and the product that resulted from that analysis is being made publicly available. And so the data is posted on a publicly facing portal, the CBio portal, that many institutions are now adopting as a common portal. There's a project being spearheaded by the American Association for Cancer Research to aggregate data even more. Now, what's being posted is the result of the analysis. What Eric is speaking to is the raw data from which that was derived. And I think that we have not, as sort of a field, come to terms with whether that data is the data that can be shared.
Why not?
Well, in some cases, it's just the size of, when we're talking about, for example, whole genome data, how to transfer that. But I think there's a movement, and people are trying to move towards ultimately being able to aggregate all that. So I think we're just not there yet. But the desire ultimately in science, in research, this is the movement to move towards posting raw data.
And I know we've got other comments, so right behind you, yep.
Thank you. I just have a question. I agree there are barriers right now to getting all the data consolidated so that physicians can use it to make more smart diagnosis. But so what can we do proactively to make this move faster? Is it going to regulation, individuals, or I'm just trying to, I know you're saying we're not there yet, but what can we do to accelerate that?
In some ways, we are there yet. I did a tour of duty at 23andMe, and I think they're actually a pretty good example of showing how you just get completely outside the system, and you can get past a lot of these barriers. So I don't know what their latest numbers are, probably pushing, 2 million people who have just voluntarily, chose to, you spit and they do a genotyping array on you, and they Esther's on the board of 23andMe, and then they ask you questions, right? You're on your mobile app, you're waiting in line at the grocery store, and you answer some quick questions about yourself, and 500 million phenotypic data points. And so the participants in this experience, they're really happy to share their data. And are they worried about privacy? Somewhat, but not to the point where they're not willing to share their information, right? They have all their online banking. If they're going to trust for online banking, they're happy to, trust a reliable, independent entity with their personal health information. And so you can actually do participatory research and actually get information back in real time about yourself, and as new publications come out. It's a completely new research paradigm, and I applaud 23andMe for being kind of one of the first people to get completely outside the system so that you can start to do this a different way.
Well, I would say that having collaborated with 23andMe, that their data is not really that accessible. Like, they do not allow you. So in the early days, they did allow you could, if you knew what you were doing, try to pull in all of that genotypic information. They now make that incredibly difficult. And when we collaborated with them on the Resilience Project, which we published recently in Nature Biotech, the idea was one of, can we identify people who are harboring very deleterious mutations that should have caused early childhood death, but these individuals are in their 40s and 50s, harbor this mutation, have never manifested that disease. Like, those are pretty amazing individuals that that have some way of buffering disease that are of benefit to humankind. And our ability to go into that information and aggregate it more completely, to do better at identifying those individuals was not so easy to do, and the access wasn't there. And I think, again, what it comes down to the question is enabling individuals to take control, to facilitating ways that they can pull that information down and facilitating ways to make that portable so they can share it with whomever they want and kind of drive that revolution. Like you put the power in the hands of the consumer where they demand that to be happening, and I think that's what's going to ignite a way more open framework than exists today.
Yeah. So we're almost out of time. Esther, final comment.
So Esther Dyson, and I'll be really brief. On 23andMe, very simply, you can download your entire genome and do whatever you like with it, but it's, if you don't know what you're doing, like my older sister, it's tough. And our contract with the customers is that we need to maintain their privacy. It's at their option to do it. Mm-hmm. But what I was really going to talk about is the Personal Genome Project, mm-hmm. where you can go online and find my personal entire sequenced genome and that of a lot of other people. And you can join the Open Humans Foundation. I mean, if you want to do something to make this happen, do it yourself and talk about it and say that no one took my genome and stuck pins into it and harmed me in any way. Yeah. And as Eric said, my email is a lot more personal, my behavior, than what I was born with.
Great. David, did you want to add? One more? That feels like a landmine. Okay, yes. Can we get a microphone here?
Yeah. Where's the one more?
Right here. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Sam Herman. So it sounds to me like it's a question of decentralization. I think that's what I'm hearing from a technology perspective. So I'm curious if, Eric, if you have any thoughts about what can you do if it sounds like you're trying to buy or somehow get access to stock data, right? That's obviously what this is on a political level. But if you could access individual data, can you do anything with it, on a smaller level?
Smaller level being,
if you get n number of patients giving you their genome and not 1 million or 2 million, individuals. Is that something you're working on?
I mean, I think it's like we all have, Andrew, myself, probably Jill, I have 400 papers. Like in those 400 papers are what genomic loci is associated with this disease, or what network of things are associated with this disease, and those happen in ends of 100 to thousands. And we all publish lots of papers on that, but you know what? Like, what's my frustration with that? We still don't have any model that really informs whether it's cancer or diabetes, like what's really going on in this individual, what is the trajectory they're on, and how do we bounce them off that onto a well trajectory? Like, we just don't have models that are sophisticated enough to do that. And why don't we have, the algorithms are there, but it's the data that you need to fit those models. We just don't have the scale. So I think we have to move beyond like what we can do with the local numbers and have to start thinking about population scale information to really affect a precision medicine, personalized medicine revolution. Like, it has to be in the millions. Like, that's the whole reason I'm moving out of a pretty comfortable position at Mount Sinai as chair of a department and making good money, but taking this high risk of going to a company is to take a shot at like getting to those big numbers, because that's the only way we're going to get to the more accurate models to affect standard of care in an information-driven way, in my opinion.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for taking the time.